Welcome to the Breadbox, a show where two nerd experts break down and review video games, movies, and more. I'm your host, Serious Sandy Shortbread, Jr. Fun fact about me, I sprained my ankle trying to go into a CVS. Yeah, pretty stupid. And I'm joined by my co-host, CaptainWaffles.
Hello. So, I was kind of curious how you sprained your ankle in CVS. Is this new?
It was like 4 days ago. I was on a lunch break from work, and I was just walking through the crosswalk, and like a dumb little idiot, I was jogging through there trying to not get hit by cars, and I put my foot right in a pothole.
Oh, that's always fun.
Yeah, and just the right angle, at just the right time, it snapped.
Well, it's a good thing that it didn't actually snap. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be doing this video today.
Yeah, probably not.
But if there's one thing that I do enjoy snapping, it's the neck of every chrysalid that has haunted my every living nightmare. So, and I believe that brings us to today's topic, yes?
Yes, and that would be the Xcom franchise. Now, I did some snooping on your Steam profile,
Oh, great.
Mr. Waffles, and I have seen that in your combined playtime, you have around somewhere between 400 hours in across multiple XCOM games of playtime, and I would say I probably have a similar
Yeah.
log time. So between the two of us, that is almost 800 hours of combined XCOM.
Yeah. It could be more because sometimes I have to play in Steam's offline mode, so I don't know if it records. But suffice to say, we both enjoyed the series quite a bit. Although I think you've beaten some of the more spin-off games, such as Apocalypse and the latest one that came out by Firaxis, the Chimera Squad. I still have not finished that. However, the mainline titles I have.
I think it would actually be fun to do another episode sometime talking about Chimera Squad specifically, because I just beat it like a few weeks ago, and I have some very strong positive and also negative feelings about it.
Yeah.
But that's not why
And
we're here today.
yes, let's look at the history.
History of XCOM. UFO or Enemy Unknown?
Well, that that is the problem, isn't it? The title itself has been a very confusing thing, and only ever more confusing when Firaxis re-picked up the Dead series.
Yes, the game was originally XCOM UFO Defense in America, but when it released in Europe, it was XCOM Enemy Unknown.
Okay.
So it had two different names for the continent, which continent you were on.
And this game came out in 1994 by Microprose. And personally, this was one of the first video games I was ever introduced to. And I swiftly became addicted.
How many hours, man?
I can't tell you that. I have no idea. It's been a lot. I think I can count on two hands how many times the final boss has been beaten. But hours, yeah, I couldn't give you that.
Did you ever beat it on Superhuman?
All right, and this is where my caveat is. Sure, I have a lot of hours, but I am not a professional at turn-based or RTS. So the hardest difficulty I never did complete, actually in any of the games. But I also have a tendency to be a filthy save scummer. So that,
I think we've all had our moment.
oh sure, yeah, we've all had moments. But it once you start, sometimes it's hard to stop. So I wanted to be able to beat it on the hardest difficulty without doing that, and I just never got to that level where I'd be able to. But I have mad respect for everybody who's able to.
only person I've actually known personally that's beaten it on Superhumans, my father. But
Oh, really?
yeah, that took him years and lots of study with next to his Windows 98 with the manual.
Yeah, the manual that's as thick as a Yellow Pages book. He also played the precursor game Laser Squad, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Big fan of the franchise, that's for sure. It's in the blood.
Yes.
Off to our first category for comparing and contrasting the old and the new. Art style. This was actually something we've been talking about a little bit before record, just about the different choices that they ended up making, especially with certain aliens like the Chrysalid, too. Basically, from him being like a little crab man to then, I believe you said he was a spider.
Yeah, imagine the desert camel spiders, but with a hard, spiky exoskeleton. And both the old sprite and the new 3D model, terrifying creatures that I would never want to come up against in real life. But even as a video game just character, terrifying concept. And one of the when I was young and playing UFO Defense, one of the worst feelings in the world was rescuing a civilian and then seeing him do a 360, scream in pain, and his body splits from head to toe, and there's just a giant crab man standing there, ready to infect the Euro soldiers next. And that got me sometimes.
Yeah. Honestly, I think that is one of the things that both games pull off so well, is just the sense of fear that they're able to instill in the person playing. I mean, when we started playing, we were young kids, but still, I even my dad, for him, it wasn't always a picnic.
Mm-hmm. Well, unlike in XCOM Enemy Unknown, made by Firaxis in the 2010s, UFO Defense had missions specifically called terror missions. And for sure, the chrysalids were there because they were just devices of terror. And you could expect them to be there on the terror missions. And they served their purpose well.
So, on a 1 to 10 scale between the updated art style, Enemy Unknown, or the original XCOM art style of unknown UFO, my bad. I'm just going to keep doing that throughout this. Which do you vibe with more? Do you vibe with the more Starship Troopers 90s aesthetic, or?
Oh man, I really like them both. There's appeal to both in everything's a 2D sprite model in the 94 game UFO Defense, and it was done well enough, especially for the time. And the 3D models made in Enemy Unknown were well polished, and there was a bit more of a focus on the graphics and making sure all the destructible scenery had every little bit and piece, brick and dust pouring down to give you more immersion into the feel of the game and kind of put you there in your soldier's boots. You're there part of the mission, not just like some overseer. And there's good to both of it. So on a scale of 1 to 10, part of my subjectivity, but I would say UFO Defense had for graphics at the time 7 or 8, and Enemy Unknown again for the time would be a 9.
Right.
It got the point across. The one thing that kind of drops the rating for me in UFO Defense was the tile sets sometimes, because there wasn't a whole wide range of different color palettes. Sometimes the tile sets could be a little confusing on, is this staircase actually there? What is it that's blocking my line of sight to this enemy? But problems like that also arose because you couldn't rotate the camera, which is a very nice asset with Enemy Unknown.
Indeed. I have to say, I probably would give UFO Defense a 9 in the art style, just because I really like the grit of it. I'd probably give the new reboot probably around a 6. Everything almost seems a little bit too smooth, a little bit too polished in certain areas, just for me.
Okay. Like, would you say that the graphics being of like the shiny, polished quality kind of pulls you away from the horror of the situation?
Yes. That's a very good way to put it. Next up, we have our difficulty category. Now, Xcom, no matter what game you're playing of it, has no limit of tests in that department.
Yeah, if we were talking about, if we had a graph of the XCOM games and we slapped up UFO Defense, Enemy Unknown, both of them up on a graph, they would be reasonably close to each other. But then if you put like Terror from the Deep on there, it would be off the charts. So it's a good thing we're not discussing that game today.
At least today, yes.
So UFO Defense, I played on, I forget what it's called. There was something like 7 different difficulties, and it was hard for me to tell what the difference was between all of them, considering there were that many difficulties. But I usually played somewhere towards the middle or a little bit on the easier side. And even then, you had some moments that made you want to put your fist through the monitor. And it was difficult. And like you mentioned earlier, everybody had their moment of doing a save scum. Like, no matter what, you just cannot escape that one turn where half your squad of like 10 guys all get shot. So you're tossing grenades around, watching them blow up so that you can figure out where the enemy is and then reloading your save. So there was certainly a challenge for that, especially because the map was just blacked out until you were close enough to see things. And then you would get the background filled in. And you could, with guys exploring the map, it was really strange for them to perhaps be in a field or next to a building, and at the end of their vision it's just complete blackness and you have no clue what's beyond it and what you're looking at. Whereas in Enemy Unknown, you can kind of pan the camera around the map a little bit, see perhaps it's a UFO in the forest, you get to see the trees, all right, the UFO's over there. Kind of makes sense. A human being's vision doesn't just get cut off at a certain range. It's just less focused. So having the enemies themselves pop in when you were close enough to observe them or round the correct corner to see them, that was a nice improvement. But XCOM Enemy Unknown, I find, also had its own level of difficulty to it, but it was a lot more straightforward. It didn't catch you off guard, and there was not like, all right, let me scratch that. In UFO Defense, you could get caught off guard, and there wasn't a whole lot you could do besides being lucky in how you set up your pieces. Whereas in Enemy Unknown, if you hyperextend, which is a genuine mistake in the gameplay, you could get surrounded and you'd be brutally punished for that with things such as permadeath. And that at least was deserved. So the nice thing about the difficulty of Enemy Unknown was you were hardly punished so much out of randomness, so much as your own faults, I would say.
One of the first analogies I used to explain it is it's Dark Souls strategy games. And I would say it even gets a little bit of one up on games like Dark Souls. Not that it's just hard, but that the fact that it actually has the cojones to actually perma kill.
Oh yes,
guys that you get attached to. Yes, it's not you're playing like the main character in Dark Souls, but game is not afraid to tell you, oh yeah, your character's dead, no resurrections, nothing else. Like, this is literally like a war simulation. And especially in the beginning, I was just playing through XCOM UFO Defense this morning before I went to work, and I literally just put one guy into the UFO. The guy was on Overwatch and shot him once and he died. Very fragile. And that's in the original game. The new updated version, depending on what difficulty you play on, you can just get hit maybe once, twice, maybe even 3 times before your guy, even at the most basic level, will go down.
Mm-hmm. And that was another source of annoyance as well. We'll talk more about the UI later, but in order to know how much health the guy had, you basically had to click on the soldier and then click on the button to bring up his stats. And unless you had the manual right there and many hours analyzing and conducting experiments on enemy firepower, it even with power armor, the end game armor, it was up to kind of a dice roll how much damage they took, and that dice range was wide. Sometimes your guys would be in the best armor and still just go down in one hit. Other guys would take something up to 7 shots before they would even pass out. And you're just wondering, what in the world? They did have stats such as health and damage resistance and mind fortitude, and that was simplified a little bit in Enemy Unknown. But even still, with those stats, it would still swing around quite a bit. It was very frustrating when you thought you had your beefy tank up forward go down instantly, and then some random person would just not die. And of course, he's probably the one that's panicking in a corner and isn't useful anyway.
I remember the first time I ever tried to play Superhuman on UFO Defense. It was the first UFO crash site. I landed my Sky Ranger down there. There was like a floater right outside the ramp. And so I had all my guys still stay in and open fire on him, and they killed him. Like, it took them like 8 shots. They killed him and then turned it over to the enemy turn. And a Muton, you gotta remember, this is the first encounter. A Muton runs up and throws a grenade into the Sky Ranger and kills all of my guys.
Oh, of course.
Only the second turn of combat.
Oh, man. You're bringing memories back. That's the sort of stuff that would happen, all right. And you know, too, that if you had sent your guys off of the vessel without realizing the Muton there, that floater would have whipped a 180 and just one-shot the first guy to try to come off the ramp.
Oh, yes. And that was something that's also something when I was doing research for this video, that Xcom was pretty much the first game to come up with the Overwatch mechanic, where if, say, you didn't move your guy enough using the time units that they have in the game for letting you do actions, if you still had enough to shoot, you saw an enemy, you would just automatically shoot at it. I don't think in all my research I couldn't find a game that had done that beforehand. And it does create a very unique flow to the game compared to other strategy games.
Yeah, I didn't realize that. But the time units thing, that was always fun to manage.
Especially where you could have a basic boy soldier that you get at the beginning of the game that has like top tier time unit slots, but then maybe another guy that's only got enough to like walk a few steps.
Exactly. Well, that's the one that you give the flying armor to.
Indeed.
Give him movement. Okay. So what would be your final rating for the difficulty between the two?
Between a 1 and 10, I would give the difficulty of UFO Defense a 10 of 10. I would give the XCOM Enemy Unknown, again, depending on which difficulty you're playing on, much more similar to the original, but I'd give it an 8.
I absolutely agree. UFO Defense is a 10, and it can be a 10 difficulty sometimes, even on those easier 2 difficulties. Enemy Unknown, with their great new invention of Iron Man mode to prevent save scumming, would absolutely force you to play your best. And if you wanted that to be on the hardest difficulty, I would also agree. Yeah, it's an 8.
Next topic for discussion. We've got the UI. Personally, again, I knew you had brought this up earlier, but the one complaint I have heard from every single XCOM player I've ever hung out with, in UFO Defense, when you hover your mouse over an option, it doesn't tell you what the button does.
That is true.
Unless you have the manual, you literally either, I mean, I guess now you look up online. Back then, internet wasn't necessarily as available to everyone. But
exactly. If somebody was talking on the phone, and there are a lot of buttons, at least in the combat missions themselves, but also in the geoscape. There were several different things for you to manage. And in the combat, you had the complexity of every single soldier, and you could have sometimes around 20 soldiers. They all have their own individual stats, their own individual inventories. you have to manage your time units, shifting around gear from their backpacks or their shoulders to their hands. That costs you time. And then perhaps arming a grenade, that costs you time. And then throwing the grenade costs you time. And it's never explicitly laid out how much time units are spent for your actions. You just have to observe very carefully and predict the trend. So kneeling, that was one action that you would do. And I never found out if it did give you an advantage, but I think it did. Kneeling so that you wouldn't be as much of a target, but always to drop down, it would be 4 time units. And to turn around, your soldiers could face in 8 different directions, north, south, east, west, and the ones immediately in between. To turn one of those 8 directions would cost you 1 time unit. So that made sense. But trying to figure out where you should put the weapons and ammo on your soldiers was a game in and of itself, trying to figure out, all right, which spot is going to cost me the least amount of time units just to move it to his hand to do this and that. And on top of all that, just firing your gun, there were often four different firing modes for the rifles, including a ranged shot, I believe it was called, for aiming down sights and taking your time, that had the highest chance to hit, but you'd only fire 1 shot often. And then there was, I believe, auto mode, where it would fire 3 shots, snapshot, which would fire 1 shot, but it was a lot quicker than the aimed shot. So you could usually pull off 2. And I can't remember, what was the 4th one? You got to help me here. Maybe it was just throw your weapon.
Yes, it was throw your weapon.
To be honest, it was just throw your weapon.
I don't believe did any damage. I think I tried once.
Yes, I did. I remember one time I ended up stunning a muton and then walked over his body and picked up his weapons. And then I tossed him a weapon to see if he would pick it up and fight back. And he ended up just fleeing, and it did no damage. But there were certainly a lot of buttons, and managing the map. And Ufo Defense's map wasn't a whole lot to talk about. It was just color coded for, like, green for a field, pixels in a top-down fashion. Oh, the buttons to just look up one level as opposed to have your soldiers move up a level or move down a level. I imagine there'll be a pasted image on the screen right now of what the UI looked like. There was a lot to go through.
I'll make sure that gets up there. But that is actually, I know I've been kind of harsh on the new reboot Enemy Unknown, but I mean, I guess it's not so new now. It's been actually, like, this is the 10th year anniversary, I believe, of it coming out, because I believe it did come out in 2012.
Yeah,
but that or 2014. I might be slipping here. But the simplistic UI, the basic movements where you get one simple action and another, like, you can move and shoot, or you can, like, sprint. Like, it does make things a little bit easier and a little bit just like, have too many options. So, do you think there could be more of, like, and I think they did achieve that some in XCOM 2, of a healthy balance in between.
Oh, yes. And the whole idea of simplifying the time units into 2 actions, essentially move and shoot, or, well, move and action. And different soldier classes might let you have 2 actions if you don't spend a movement, this and that. And simplifying the time units down to that sort of scale makes it absolutely a whole lot less of a headache trying to manage every single soldier. And also, it broadens up the game to way more of an audience. It's more appealing. Everybody has 2 different actions, basically, that they can take.
I do believe they are called action points.
Action points, yes, okay. And that was the thing, too. In Ufo Defense, even the time units were different between soldiers. And on top of that, they had stamina. And maybe you had the time units, but if you had them running for too long, their stamina was too low to move. So they had time units to shoot, but not to move. And
None of those
toss
bars were
in things
labeled.
like bravery. Oh no, you had the green bar was the time unit bar, the orange bar was the stamina one. I believe white was
Bravery.
like mental bravery, yes. And the statistics for the soldiers in Enemy Unknown basically boil down to move distance and psionic ability, and the accuracy. It all boiled down to way more simple matters than having to manage every single thing. Not having to waste turn units just so that your soldier could do a 360 and scope out the entire area. That's a nice feature in Enemy Unknown. It just makes sense. If they're able to move, you get to see them in their idle animations, kind of peeking their head over cover, looking around. The simplification was very welcome by me.
Yeah. Definitely saves a lot of time and needless micromanaging of the men.
Mm-hmm.
And women. We can't forget about the women.
Yes, that's true.
All right.
Although the one thing that is an absolute downgrade is the complete lack of triangle haircuts. Now they were brought back in, I believe, in XCOM 2. I think was the first time that they were reintroduced, just as a throwback. But that was a very iconic look for the sprites in the 90s soldiers.
They actually
the men had these.
They
Yes?
actually did add it in for Enemy Unknown. It was a DLC that you had to pay for. They did.
Oh, okay. Okay. But yes, the tricorn looking blonde haircut. that was iconic for sure.
That was something that I noticed, and I was almost a little bit worried when I was playing my most recent playthrough this morning, was that every single person on my Sky Ranger was Aryan. With blonde hair and blue eyes, even though when I looked at their inventories, there was different mixed ethnicities in my crew, but from the top view, they were all Aryan.
Right. I think there was a glitch too where you could click on the soldiers' statistics and inventory screen and you would see them standing there in the armor that they wore.
Yeah.
And you would see people of different skin tones. But then you would go back into the main combat screen and they might be a different tone entirely. Yeah. It was kind of odd.
Maybe racist? We don't know. All right.
But yeah, even the UI for the geoscape and your base, there was a whole lot. And thankfully, at least in the geoscape for UFO Defense, there was the UFOpedia. And that helped give a little bit more explanation behind the statistics and descriptions of weapons, UFOs, enemies, base pieces as you assembled them, the recent technology and lore. It was all kind of tossed into the UFOpedia. But understanding how to use the charts, because there was a chart tab and showed you different graphs of things like alien activity and where funding from different nations is going, that would certainly have to take some time learning how to interpret and use to your benefit. And then you have Enemy Unknown. Kind of comes down to, all right, here is your anthill farm, I believe was the term used by Jake Solomon in his description of the game's development. And we're going to boil it down. You don't have multiple bases. You have the one base. Here are the different areas that you can build your base pieces. And here's engineering. Here's research. And there we go. That's good. There was a lot more simplification, again, in the Geoscape area for Enemy Unknown, which did come out in 2012. I just looked it up.
10-year anniversary. That's why we're doing it.
Yes, 10-year anniversary. You still had fighters, and you still had, aerial fighters, and you could still swap weapons, even on them, just like you could in UFO Defense. But having it boil down to just one base and not having to, shifting resources, just the simple fact that you would make weapons but not have to worry about the ammo that was a very welcome improvement in my eyes.
Mhm.
And having something like 8 forward operating bases in UFO Defense, I would set up 7 or 8 different ones with just a single hangar bay with a fighter and a long range and short range sensor setup.
Wow.
And then I would have perhaps one base, maybe a second, that would have the proper research labs and the soldier housing. But in order to get coverage of the globe, that's what I would do, have a whole bunch of forward operating bases. Trying to manage the ammo and what weapons and what fighters went to what bases, that you had to stay on top of it. So having just the one base, and perhaps some hardcore 90s games fans would get mad at me for saying this, but having just the one base and not having to manage the ammo between bases, that was nice, I found.
One thing I may disagree with you on that is I actually really loved the base design for XCOM UFO Defense. The anthill, where you always had to keep clearing out debris before you could build anything, actually did bother me. Because I like just the open freedom that you're given your plot, and yes, they give you the basic base of, okay, this is how it's laid out, but then you can kind of just do whatever with the rest of it. I did like that freedom.
Yes, I will clarify. I really did enjoy customizing how the base was laid out. It was more so the shifting and managing supplies between all your bases. That was the annoyance. But I really did like having the base set up in a very particular way, so that if the the aliens invaded it, I would have a kill corridor where they would have to get funneled down through, and that was fun, just lining them up down the kill corridor.
Yes, sir. So what would you give your user friendliness rating for Enemy Unknown?
For Enemy Unknown, it's very friendly. It is hard for someone completely new to the series to not understand what is going on. So I would give it a 9. No, 9 or 10. It's very well done. It is simplified, still has elements of complexity to it, but you're not guessing what you're doing. And for UFO Defense, the UI friendliness, I would say, is a 5.
You matched my scores exactly. I had written them down as we were talking because I was just like, I already know what my score is going to be. And so I also did 5 and a 9.
Yeah. This is now the question is that 5 including the manual?
Yes. I love the XCOM UFO Defense. Like you, it was like one of the first, probably maybe besides Spy Fox, one of the first video games I ever played. But that being said, it does not mean it doesn't have its faults, and this is one of the biggest ones for me.
Absolutely. Trying to introduce people these days who are used to games like the Firaxis series of XCOM, trying to get them into UFO Defense would be a challenge for sure.
There's definitely like a learning curve or just a bar that somebody has to meet to where they have just the emotional willingness to put up with what the game throws out at
them. Yes, and most of the time that will be grenades.
Yes. All right. The next general discussion we have was on the story. I mean, they basically follow the same kind of general story because one game was based off the other, but they do diverge in certain areas, if not in more nuanced ways. The Firaxis series has a very cinematic feel with, or even with, like, say, again, we're not specifically referencing it, but XCOM 2, where in the DLC War of the Chosen, they add in specific NPCs on the alien side that talk and converse with you like no antagonist in XCOM ever has, since it's mostly just, in all the other games, the faceless, screaming alien horde bearing down on you. So, I would say that XCOM the new XCOM with Firaxis is going for a much more cinematic story feel. Whereas with XCOM UFO Defense, a lot of what you're getting for story is either through very short cinematics that don't really tell you a lot, or you're just reading a wall of text.
Yes, it went very in UFO Defense. Understanding the lore was a whole lot like when Bungie's game Destiny 1 first came out, and you had to go and just read lore on items in the UFOpedia, and that was your main source because there were no cutscenes until you got to the end, and apart from the intro. Whereas, and oh, this probably should have been mentioned in. Yes, so there were a lot more cinematics seen in Enemy Unknown, and such things as the kill shots being somewhat cinematic. That was pretty neat. It broke up the gameplay a little bit where you kind of had a moment of, oh, something is going to die. And that was a nice little dopamine hit. Whereas in UFO Defense, everything just kind of happens. And there's no glorification nor remorse on anything until you get to your monthly finance report. And trust me, there was a lot of remorse there.
Just like in real life, right?
Exactly. But the story itself, I don't know. Should we do spoilers or no spoilers?
Oh, let's do non-spoilers for now.
Oh, okay. So no spoilers here. But the story, again, starts off the same. Aliens invade Earth. And the year of the invasion lines up in each game around the same time that those games were released. 90s to 1000 for UFO Defense and the 10s for Enemy Unknown, or maybe it was the 2020s. It's been a little while. But what happens from there does branch out a bit. And where you go in the stories is certainly not the same place. But I have to say, I really enjoyed the ending of UFO Defense a lot more than Enemy Unknown because of the excitement of the final few missions. Man, I can't talk about, if we're not doing spoilers, exactly what was so cool about it. But at the end, the feeling of XCOM UFO Defense was very much, I would say, like Starship Troopers, nitty gritty, and you're fighting this crazy war against some alien race, and you're just tossing cannon fodder into it. So by the time you get to the end, and the ending is somewhat similar to perhaps like Starship Troopers, and there is some satisfaction to the way the game finishes. Enemy Unknown won't spoil its ending either, but you don't. If you know what I'm saying, you don't go to the same length in accomplishing what the goal is. The story was written out. There was a story they wanted to tell, and they did it pretty well through the use of cutscenes and other pieces of gameplay. And it was solidly done.
Both of us have very similar views of XCOMs and on other things as well. But there was, when I finally did beat Enemy Unknown, I remember just kind of this feeling of emptiness, like, oh, that's it. Like, this is the end. Compared to when I had played UFO Defense, where it was this, like, there's this momentum and this build-up and this eventual just payoff that just feels so much more satisfying, at least to me.
Oh, yes. Even the failure was, well, it wasn't satisfying, but the screen and the lore that you got in UFO Defense for failing was devastating. At least the first time, because if you're playing on Superhuman, you're probably seeing that screen a lot. Enemy Unknown, I don't think I ever failed a campaign once, which in one way is nice because it really, really hurts when you've been playing for perhaps several hundred hours into the game, and then somewhere near the end you lose. that is rough to try to redo all that progress.
I actually did lose one game of Enemy Unknown that I played, and it was with the new DLC that they had done, Enemy Within.
Oh, really?
Do you want me to tell you the cutscene they do if you
Well,
lose?
I did it. All right, I will caveat. I did intentionally throw by like passing time in the geoscape without interacting with any missions, just to see what the ending looked like when you failed. And it was interesting. Again, it's a cutscene, and you see some pieces interact with each other in interesting ways. Again, was not quite the same level of devastation I felt. It kind of alludes to what happens to the planet, but it doesn't explicitly say the horrors that are going to happen to it like UFO Defense does.
Very true. So what would you give your story rating then?
I think I'll mix it up a little bit instead of giving a 1 through 10. I would say if you're looking for the way a story makes you feel, UFO Defense has that. But if you're looking for the actual construction of a stereotypical story where you have the intro, rising action, climax, and finish of it, as you might learn in some literary class, that is definitely played out in Enemy Unknown.
All right. I would definitely agree. For my number rating, I just gave UFO Defense a 7.5. Which was actually this was probably the hardest category for me to even just approach with giving a score for either, just because it is something that's so subjective to somebody's personal playthrough. I feel like UFO Defense would have been a 10 for me if there hadn't just been so much wall of text. And I mean, I read the wall of text, I enjoy the wall of text. Just having that all the time and that being pretty much all there is was a little bit harder to get into. And so I gave it a 7.5 UFO Defense, and for Enemy Unknown, I gave it an 8.
Oh, there we go. Pretty close together. I have to say, though, they're both similar in the game concept, but it's a fun thing. I mean, being the only group of people who can save the planet against an alien invasion of this scale, it's a fun story to be involved in, no matter how it plays out.
Yeah. I walk into a room in Hollywood and I'm like, oh, you want a movie about a dark shadow organization funded, like it's like the dark UN that's got to defend the world when like aliens invade, and everybody would be like, ooh, sign me up for that movie. I want to make it.
Exactly.
Like, you could pretty much almost put that in any time period. It would be a good movie. Like, it doesn't have to be set in the 90s and the 2010s.
Oh, yes.
Imagine XCOM Revolutionary War. Like pulling Assassin's Creed and just...
Oh, that would be a very one-sided war.
Oh, yes.
That brings us to the gameplay, which we've sort of already been touching on a little bit, but the fun of it. And they're both fun, I would say, but they're directed at different people. So UFO Defense came out in 1994, and back then, there were some online games, but the internet for the average person was a dial-up connection. And if you don't know what that sounds like, I feel a little sad for you. But these games would usually be done by, the quote-unquote nerds. And that's probably why you see so many things like stats and comparing charts and individual management. And being somewhat that sort of person, that gameplay absolutely appealed to me. I did enjoy reading things. I did enjoy the individual management, even if it was overbearing a little bit at times. But just seeing how the stats for one soldier kind of leaned him down. All right, so this guy's more of a sniper. This guy has a really good grenade throwing skill. So, all right, he's my grenadier sort of person. That was fun. And that sort of categorization of soldiers was improved upon in Enemy Unknown with just the class system. And I think when they were developing the game, the people who had played UFO Defense must have all realized, hey, we all classify soldiers based upon their stats. So why don't we just have classes? Be done with the whole thing. So, and that's fun too, playing into your soldiers' strengths. I really like the business management side of things as well. I like simulators and some different business tycoon games, and UFO Defense goes all in on the business simulation, hiring your researchers and hiring soldiers, ammo, weapon management. So that was fun. And Enemy Unknown takes the business management and still has it to a degree, but like I mentioned earlier, with simplification of bases to just a single base, the focus was absolutely more on the honed in shooting side of things. It was always a big rush whenever you finally research some new technology. That's always a huge lot of fun, seeing what new goodies you have to take to the battlefield. And I found that the gameplay on the combat fields themselves was a lot more rewarding in Enemy Unknown.
For me, I was just thinking about going into this video. I wanted to know, when we were thinking about this specific thing, I wanted to know not just how they compared with each other, but how the gameplay compared to the other games that people could play in that year. And this year, I did not realize that so many things released in 1994. 1994 was the year when the Game Boy was first released. It was the Sega Genesis came out, and also the Super NES made its launch. And also the PlayStation. So that's a lot of just big console releases. With games, they had Donkey Kong Country, Street Fighter, Final Fantasy VI, or when it was released at the time, known as Final Fantasy III, Mortal Kombat 2, NBA Jam, Sonic and Knuckles, Super Metroid.
The original.
Yes, the original Super Metroid. For all the people who took the time out of their lives in 1994 to play this game, they had to have a lot of commitment and a lot of love for this type of game, for all of the other, to basically ignore all the other great games that were coming out at the time and be like, no, I want to be an XCOM.
I'm not entirely sure what the console war looked like back then, but I imagine there was still quite a split between computer PCs and consoles, which before 94, I believe Sega was kind of leading that front.
That is true. There was still quite a split. But for other like DOS games, there was Elder Scrolls Arena, TIE Fighter. Do you remember playing that game?
Yes. Star Wars TIE Fighter. What a simulator that was.
Doom 1 and Doom 2.
Oh,
So,
yes.
all of some great classics. And actually, in December 21st of 1994, pretty much almost the exact opposite end of the year from UFO Defense, we've got your old pal there, CaptainWaffles. Bungie released Marathon on the Mac. For the time, graphics were good. For the time, the game was extremely fun. When Enemy Unknown came out, what a big splash in the water. Because a lot of games at that point, a lot of people were afraid to do turn-based, because a lot of game companies, I believed, thought that it would be boring. Boring for the average consumer. But what Enemy Unknown and Firaxis was able to do was to show that turn-based combat can be fun and still fast-paced.
True.
And I think a lot of that has to do with a little bit of sometimes people abusing the Overwatch system. But I don't know. When I had like my squad of like 4 snipers all camped out in their hover,
that is
they were
true.
flying jetpack suits, and the little muton walked out of the building and got sniped from 4 different angles. That did feel pretty good. I'm not gonna lie.
Yes, the end game content for both games was pretty fun.
Really, kind of fun part of the game comes to when you're on even ground with the aliens, and then it ends.
Yeah, that is true. The focus for both of them, I would say, is absolutely the struggle, because once you start really taking it to them, that's it. Like you took it to them, and yeah, that's it.
Basically, where you just throw one big punch when you're finally on even ground, and then the aliens are utterly decimated.
Right.
It's this long struggle of maybe a year or two of you getting pounded, and then you finally get one attack off and you win.
Right. You go on the offense, and that's it. That is, of course, if you played the games correctly. If you try to go prematurely, you'll probably get your face mopped all over the floor.
Yeah,
You have to understand when you're at the right level. Everything's kitted out the way you want. You have the end game gear. Oh man, if you went into the ending of UFO Defense without psionics being fully developed across all your soldiers, I imagine it would be a whole different battle.
indeed. I do remember watching my father play one time, and this was on Superhuman. He didn't have a couple, like, I think his half his squad didn't have psionics, and basically it just got all turned into mind controlling against the other guys and just shot and killed them all. Right when they were in the last, like, room. Like, not to give much away, but when they were in the last room where you're supposed to blow up the thing, like in every sci-fi thing, it all just ended with a pile of the troopers' bodies.
Oh, yes, mind control is such a shame, but having it is what a blessing. It feels so
It
good.
also lets you step into the shoes of the overpowered aliens and
Exactly.
use them to your good.
But I found that in both games here, once I got to that point, you kind of knew the end was coming, so I would just intentionally get into fights and drag them out. Not for the resources because you're doing fine at that point, and
Mhm.
I would just do it so that I could finally have those fights. Like, yeah, take that. That's for killing this guy and that guy earlier. And now I'm like turning you against each other and having my flying sniper squad just overwatch all of you. It was a lot of revenge. But I have to say, though, I don't think anything is as much of a cheese in life as being able to immediately research las rifles and then living completely off of them. I don't know if UFO Defense was designed this way or if it was somewhat of an oversight, but you will pretty much never need government funding again once you've researched laser rifles. And then you just make sure you have enough of your production producing them and selling them off onto the market, and that you'll start making millions and millions.
You just start becoming an arms dealer.
Yeah, exactly. It's an arms dealer simulator with a side of alien fighting. And that's probably for a good reason that that mechanic was gone in Enemy Unknown, because you do have to rely on the United Governments for your credits.
This one's a tough one. I don't want to be like too positive but too negative either. Like, both games are really fun.
But again, made for different people. Being kind of nerdy and stat appreciative, I really like UFO Defense. I would give it, and if you're that sort of person, I would say you could solidly say it's a 9 or 10. It fulfills a lot of your statistics referencing. It simulates almost every aspect that you could possibly simulate. Enemy Unknown was definitely more focused on the mainstream video gamers of 2012, and most of which, this is a younger generation that has probably never heard of XCOM series before, that ended right around 2000, trying to bring it back to the young kids that are used to the nicer graphics and the tighter gameplay loop. You simply couldn't have a simulator of that degree and yet still have the difficulty and yet also make millions of dollars off of it. I would say, yeah, it wasn't so much a business simulator as a just a real tight, real time. Sorry, not RTS, a turn-based strategy.
Definitely more focused on the action and the strategy or like the management side of things.
And perhaps part of the difficulty here in saying who it was made for was just the fact that over the 15 or so years between these games, the game industry changed so much. So now you could say things like there is a RTS or turn-based or FPS, different categories of games. Whereas certainly like Doom that came out around UFO Defense, that was a first-person game, but they weren't so popular that you had all these different categories and people in their own genre coming into the turn-based strategy genre of that was the market that Firaxis was dealing with. So they tailored it to the younger people of that genre. I mean, they did well. As you can see, it became popular for good reason. And I think because of the game coming out, some people who'd never heard of the original XCOM series checked out UFO Defense. And I don't know of anyone who did, but yeah, you could tell that both of them were made with a deep care and attention to all sorts of details to make sure that they could be as fun as they possibly could be for what they were trying to make. I would say, uh, without accounting for how many times I threw a controller across the room out of anger, I would say overall nines.
Right. Yeah, for me, it was really close because I enjoyed them for different reasons, but ended up giving UFO Defense 8.5 just because it was literally one of the first games I ever played. Enemy Unknown gets an 8. They were both equally fun, equally enjoyed them. Like you said before, the audience was quite different. I think it does say a lot though, when even though we're saying that the game audience for XCOM UFO Defense was designed for people maybe in their like 30s, mid 20s, 40s at the time, that us before we even really reached the age of 10, 12 could enjoy it.
That is true.
Last and final category, since we already kind of covered the genre and the audience, and along with the gameplay, where would you say does each game fall in the replayability scale?
Oh,
Does it get
yes.
stale after a while? Is there just a certain song that plays over and over again and gets really annoying?
For UFO Defense, I I think the replayability was there for me because I was an obsessed maniac for the game to the point of annoying my whole family about it. And I would say if you keep losing because you don't have the manual and you don't understand the functions of the game, well, if you want to win, of course you're going to be replaying it. But it's not like there are branching paths. So once you've beaten it, you've kind of beaten it. The only reason you'd have to replay it is if you just want to go through the whole thing again, perhaps by starting with your first base in a different part of the globe. But there's not anything trying to really encourage you to do it over again. And with Enemy Unknown, I played it off its initial release. So then when its DLC came out, where you could chop up your soldiers' body limbs into making them these robot sort of things, genetically enhancing them, that made me start up a new game to run through with that DLC installed. And I ran through again with the very popular mod Long War installed. So I did 3 or so playthroughs to the end of Enemy Unknown. But again, once you're at the end, no real branching paths or whatnot, no real incentive for you to play it over. But with the exception of the Long War mod and Enemy Within, that's the name of the DLC. So I would say there's more replayability with Enemy Unknown because perhaps you might want to go through it vanilla first and then try it out with the mods and whatnot. But also because of the added function of multiplayer. We cannot forget that. You'd be able to point by a squad, and you and I pitted squads against each other at the time.
Many a good times.
Yes. How does this mixture of humans and aliens go up against my opponents? And that was a fun feature, which I don't know how well it was used across all the players, but that was fun, certainly for a couple of XCOM enthusiasts.
It definitely was a nice sandbox where you got to test like different strengths and weaknesses of different alien builds. Like I remember that just realizing how different strategies against cyber discs in particular worked differently playing those multiplayer games, especially since you'd always seem to have one hiding in the background for when I left myself an opening to get decimated.
Yes, those things were nasty. I'm so glad that they kept the cyber disc, although remade a little bit in function and look from UFO Defense. That was a fun alien to play with.
Fresh coat of paint, you might say.
Yes. So as for a replayability score, I would say that both score fairly low. UFO Defense, uh, like a 2, and
Ooh.
Enemy Unknown, I'd give a 3 or a 4 based upon if you don't want to dive in to the mods and the DLCs on your first go around. Unless you're a super fan and fall hardcore in love with this, you're not going to have a great reason to redo it.
I really, really liked replaying the original. I don't know if that's just because I liked putting my bases in different areas or just trying different strategies at how I was playing the game. Kind of like you were saying about doing different things, like just starting, like being a black market dealer with selling a bunch of weapons off or stuff like that. Just UFO Defense, there's a lot that you can't control. And so just kind of almost like throwing the paint up against the wall and saying like, oh, what kind of painting does it make this time? Like there's literally in both games, but I feel like more so in the original, an infinite amount of things that can happen each combat. From the amount of like even people trying to save scum to get an eventual outcome that where they win. Like there's infinite number of things that could happen depending on the choices you make. So I actually give replayability for UFO Defense as a 6 for myself. And for Enemy Unknown, I've beaten it once on one of the harder difficulties. And after I did that, trying to go back and playing it on some of the other difficulties just wasn't as enjoyable to me. So I actually give it a 5.
Yes, the replayability scored low for me, but these are long games. I mean, you can spend a lot of hours. As we said at the beginning, combined, we've put in over 800. That's a lot of time that you could put in for just a handful of different campaign runs. So it doesn't necessarily need to be very replayable.
All right. Do you want to know the totals, my good friend?
Well, let's hear it.
For UFO Defense, we have a grand total of 72.5. For Enemy Unknown, surprisingly to myself, was out on top with a 74.5. 2-point margin.
Well, there you go. I would say that's pretty appropriate too. Made for slightly different people, but both very fun. And I would say that the success, although UFO Defense was not as financially successful as Enemy Unknown was, even accounting for inflation by quite a margin. But for those who played them, they were both successful for their genres.
I would say that's just a testament to how good each game is, honestly.
Hearing the devlogs and the interviews that Jake Solomon, lead designer for the XCOM series underneath Firaxis, he was a hardcore UFO Defense fan. He played it many times, and he wanted to stay very true to it, make Enemy Unknown basically just a modern adaptation of UFO Defense, not putting any spin on it. He waited to put spin on XCOM 2 made by them. And I would say he handled the project very well. And
I think it's a very respectful homage to something. And like you have 800 hours, he probably has 1600 hours in the game.
Easy. Especially being a person a little bit older than the two of us. He probably had his own computer when the game came out.
Anyways, thank you for watching, for suffering along with us. If you're here, remember to like and subscribe and leave a comment about another video you'd like us to do, or maybe a different subject or game you'd like us to break down.